What do we do with the parts of history that seem to resist being remembered? Not the famous battles, not the speeches, not the monuments cast in bronze, but the quieter remnants, the sealed hatch in a winter forest, the corridor hidden behind a broken wall, the machine left humming after the hands that built it were gone. War is often described through noise, yet some of its deepest mysteries survive in silence. In the final years of the Second World War, Europe became a landscape of ash, steel, and hurried forgetting. Armies advanced, governments collapsed, entire systems of belief were buried beneath rubble. And in that collapse, scattered across forests, mountains, tunnels, monasteries, and frozen coastlines, there appeared strange traces of projects no official history fully claimed. Facilities without names, instruments without clear purpose, records that ended where explanation should have begun. Some of these discoveries sounded impossible, even to the people who found them. A chamber that seemed built to alter memory, a signal receiver listening for something no one could identify, vaults designed not merely to store information, but to hide it from time itself. Each fragment was incomplete. Each witness saw only a corner of the larger shape. Yet together they suggest something haunting, that beneath the visible war ran another current, one driven not only by weapons and territory, but by obsession with the mind, the future, and the boundaries of human control. This is not a story of body certainty. It is a journey through evidence, rumor, engineering, fear, and the strange hunger to master what should perhaps remain beyond us. The deeper we go, the less this becomes a tale of secret machines or lost programs. It becomes a meditation on ambition, on what people will risk when they believe history can be rewritten not just on paper, but inside matter, memory, and time. And perhaps the most unsettling question is not what was built, but why so much effort was spent making sure it would never be understood. What if the first clue was not a document, but warmth rising from frozen ground? In the autumn of 1944, long before the war reached its final reckoning, villagers near the forested edge of occupied Poland began describing something they could not name. At dusk, the earth seemed to tremble. A low mechanical murmur passed through the trees after sunset and lingered until morning. It was not artillery, not trucks, not weather. It sounded, they said, as if the soil itself had learned to breathe. A Soviet reconnaissance team was eventually sent to investigate. What they found was less a battlefield installation than a wound hidden under leaves and roots. Beyond a neglected security perimeter, beneath a skin of dirt and frost, stood a steel dome half buried in the forest floor. It had been abandoned, but not surrendered. Even in bitter cold, the metal remained strangely warm. Inside, the chamber was lined with lead, copper, and silence. At its center, anchored deep into bedrock, rose a cylindrical core that gave off a steady vibration through the boots of every man who approached it. Radiation readings were abnormal. Samples carried traces of graphite and uranium. Yet the layout did not resemble any of the reactor designs officially associated with the era. This was something else, either a prototype, an improvised engine, or a machine built for a purpose no surviving file was willing to admit. Then, almost immediately, the trail narrowed. Reports were seized. Photographs vanished. The unit was reassigned. The forest was closed under convenient excuses, and history moved on as it so often does when something resists explanation. But decades later, satellites still registered unexplained heat in the same region. And that is what makes the story linger. Not only the possibility that such a machine existed, but the deeper unease that comes with it. How many things in human history are not forgotten because they were unimportant, but because someone decided they should remain buried under the noise of war? What if a war could continue not on the battlefield, but inside the mind of a single human being? In January 1945, as Allied troops pushed through the wreckage of Western Germany, engineers clearing a shattered government building found something hidden beneath the debris. Behind a collapsed stairwell and a wall of reinforced concrete was an underground chamber that felt less like a bunker than a laboratory designed to erase the ordinary rules of personhood. The air was stale. The rooms were padded. Chairs with restraints stood in a circle beneath a suspended mechanical apparatus, as if the space had been built not to heal the sick but to unmake them. Glass vials were stacked in coded rows. Later analysis linked their contents to compounds known to distort memory, fear, and perception. Nearby, scorched fragments of paperwork describe cycles of sleeplessness, suggestion, chemical intervention, and electrical stimulation. The language was clinical, but the aim was unmistakable. Weaken the self, then rebuild obedience in its place. There were no patient records, no names, no signatures, only traces. Villagers in the area spoke of trucks arriving after dark and of cries that never carried far beyond the walls. Some recalled men entering in chains and emerging days later with vacant expressions, speaking like actors reciting lines they had not chosen. Military transfer lists from late 1944 added another unsettling detail. Soldiers held under medical observation, who later returned to combat showing no fear, little pain response, and signs of dissociation. Then, as with so many discoveries at the edge of defeat, the record narrowed. The site was sealed. Documents were classified. The remaining materials were relocated and later disappeared from inventory. Even the structure itself was eventually destroyed, and perhaps that is what lingers most. Not simply the possibility that such experiments occurred, but the recognition that identity is more fragile than we like to believe. Under enough pressure, with enough science and cruelty, how much of a person can be stripped away before the body continues on without the self? What if the next battlefield was never meant to be seen at all? By the winter of 1945, the war above ground had become a map of collapsing fronts and exhausted armies. But beneath that visible struggle, another kind of contest was taking shape. One concerned not with land, but with perception. In a confiscated research compound near the Harz Mountains, Allied teams encountered rooms crowded with coils, antenna arrays, oscillators, and recording drums unlike anything they expected to find in a conventional military laboratory. It looked less like an armory than an attempt to turn electricity into influence. The recovered notes were fragmentary, technical, and maddeningly incomplete. They described experiments involving directed frequencies, variable pulse patterns, and the measured effects of sound beyond ordinary hearing. Some pages referred to disorientation, emotional disturbance, sleep interruption, and compliance states produced without direct physical contact. Others hinted at a larger ambition to interfere with morale, judgment, or even collective behavior from a distance. There is an understandable temptation to treat such claims as fantasy, the residue of wartime desperation. And perhaps some of it was exactly that, anxious speculation dressed in scientific language. But war has always invited strange alliances between imagination and engineering. When fear becomes systematic, even the most abstract idea can attract funding, personnel, and steel. Witnesses later spoke of field tests conducted in isolated zones where soldiers reported headaches, panic, ringing in the ears, and a sensation of dread with no visible source. None of this proves the machine worked as intended. It may have failed completely. It may have produced effects far smaller than its designers hoped. Yet the existence of the effort itself tells us something important about the age that produced it. Every war reveals what a civilization is willing to invent when it believes survival is at stake. And here, in these humming circuits and speculative diagrams, we glimpse a disturbing threshold. The moment when force no longer seems sufficient, and the dream emerged of entering the human nervous system itself, not with a bullet, but with a signal. If power can reach us without touch, without language, without being seen, how would we even know when our thoughts are no longer entirely our own? What if the most dangerous machine in the war was not built to destroy the present, but to anticipate it? In April 1945, as Allied forces moved toward Leipzig through a Germany already beginning to look like memory, a fortified communications bunker fell into their hands. At first, it appeared ordinary enough: radio gear, coded traffic, the worn machinery of command. But behind a vault door, beyond a narrow corridor that seemed designed to discourage curiosity, they found a chamber with a very different atmosphere. Circular, dimly lit, and centered on a device that seemed to belong to another age and another future at once. It was made of concentric metal rings suspended inside a gyroscopic frame, surrounded by counters, dials, and calibrated discs. No visible wiring fed it, no obvious motor drove it. Yet witnesses claimed it produced a steady resonance that disrupted nearby radio equipment and made ordinary instruments unreliable. Dust covered the floor, but the machine itself was clean, intact, almost expectant. Documents found nearby offered only fragments, a phrase that translated roughly to time-form analysis, and a repeated note in the margin suggesting a prediction point. That was enough to unsettle the physicists called in to inspect it. Their cautious interpretation was extraordinary. The machine may have been designed to process shifting probabilities, to model future outcomes by continuously adjusting variables in motion, not electronically, but through magnetism, pressure, and precise mechanical relationships. The modern vocabulary for such a device did not yet exist. Even now, calling it a primitive quantum computer may say more about our imagination than about the machine itself. And yet, the speed with which it vanished from the record is hard to ignore. Within days, the chamber was sealed, the device dismantled, and its components shipped away in unmarked crates. Maybe it was only an elaborate failure. Maybe it never produced anything but noise. But the idea behind it remains deeply human. In times of chaos, we long not merely for victory, but for certainty. And if war teaches anything, it is how quickly the wish to foresee the future can become its own form of power. What if one of the war's strangest inventions was designed not to kill more efficiently, but to blur the line between human will and mechanical obedience? In the final months of the conflict, American troops entering a damaged industrial complex near Nuremberg discovered a workshop unlike the assembly halls around it. The main factory floors had produced familiar instruments of war, metal casings, engines, electrical parts. But in a lower level, protected by coated locks, they found benches covered with delicate headgear, copper filaments, ceramic insulators, and anatomical diagrams of the brain marked with mathematical notations. It looked less like a factory than a place where engineering had begun to imitate the nervous system. Among the seized materials were helmet-like devices fitted with contact points along the temples and base of the skull. Nearby files referred to motor response amplification, conditioned action, and externally triggered behavior. There were also references to test subjects performing tasks after exposure to rhythmic pulses and directed stimulation, sometimes with unusual speed, sometimes with a troubling absence of hesitation. None of the notes claimed total control. The language was more cautious than that. But the ambition was unmistakable: to shorten the distance between command and action until the body responded almost before conscious thought had time to interfere. It is possible these efforts never moved beyond crude experimentation. Wartime laboratories were full of ideas that promised far more than they delivered. Yet even failed attempts can reveal the fears of an era. Here the fear seems to have been uncertainty itself, the unreliable human pause, the moment of doubt, fatigue, grief, or moral resistance that no army can fully eliminate. That may be why this forgotten workshop feels so modern. It speaks to a recurring temptation in technological societies, the belief that efficiency is always an improvement, that fewer questions and faster responses must mean progress. But a person's hesitation is not always weakness. Sometimes it is conscience. Sometimes it is the last remaining evidence that a decision is still human. And once a machine is invited into that small, private interval between impulse and action, what exactly are we hoping to remove, the error or the soul? What if memory could be carried not only in the mind but in the body? In April 1945, when the war had already begun to fracture into smoke, retreat, and hurried disappearance, a convoy was seen leaving a laboratory hidden in the mountains near Innsbruck. The trucks carried refrigerated containers, sealed crates, and medical equipment more suited to a hospital than a military retreat. No wounded were ever registered. No official destination was logged. The vehicles entered the Tyrolean roads and seemed to dissolve into the landscape. Weeks later, allied investigators reached the laboratory itself. Much of it had been emptied with deliberate care. Shelves were bare. Records had been burned. Instruments were dismantled. Yet one refrigerated chamber remained locked, almost as though it had been missed in panic or spared on purpose. Inside sat a small row of coated vials and a leather-bound journal describing a project that now reads like an argument with the very nature of identity. The theory was simple in wording and devastating in implication. This trauma, the authors believed, did not end in thought alone. It left a physical signature in blood. Not merely stress chemistry, but a deeper imprint, something like experience condensed into tissue and carried through the body like a hidden script. If that imprint could be extracted and preserved, they reasoned, it might be transferred into another person. The journal described test subjects receiving injections followed by sudden, disorienting changes. Some began speaking unfamiliar languages. Others described memories from places they had never seen. A few seemed overtaken by fear or violence, tied to experiences that belonged to someone else entirely. Whether these accounts reflected real results, misinterpretation, or the fantasies of desperate researchers, the moral shock remains the same. The experiment imagined memory as a substance, portable, transferable, severed from consent. That idea lingers because it touches something sacred. We think of memory as the private architecture of a life, the invisible room where a self is formed. But if suffering can move from one body into another, then the borders between people are less secure than we imagine. And perhaps the question is not whether such a project truly worked, but why human beings are so often tempted to treat even pain as something that can be stored, owned, and used. What if a war's most enduring secret was not hidden in a weapon, but in a room built to outlast memory itself? Near the end of the conflict, as cities collapsed and ministries burned their archives by the truckload, a remote monastery in southern Germany became the site of an unusually quiet operation. Local residents later recalled military vehicles arriving at night, without insignia, carrying crates that required 4 men to lift, and guards who spoke little, even among themselves. The old stone complex had survived centuries of weather and prayer. Now it was being used for something far less peaceful. When the site was finally inspected after the war, most of the cargo had vanished. But deep beneath the monastery, behind a chapel floor altered more recently than the rest of the structure, investigators discovered a vault lined with insulating metals and sealed against moisture, heat, and magnetic interference. It was not arranged like a treasury. There was no gold, no ceremonial object, no ordinary archive. Instead, the chamber had been engineered to preserve documents, film reels, and encoded cylinders, and tiny metal canisters whose labels suggested scientific catalogs rather than religious relics. Some of the surviving index pages referred to propulsion research, neurological trials, atmospheric experiments, and material studies that did not fit neatly into any single branch of wartime science. The pattern implied a larger intention. This was not merely storage, it was selection. Someone had decided which fragments of knowledge deserved to survive defeat and which would be carried into whatever world came next. That act of curation feels almost more revealing than the research itself. In moments of collapse, people do not save everything. They save what they fear losing most. Sometimes that is beauty. Sometimes it is evidence. Sometimes it is power disguised as information. The monastery vault invites a difficult reflection. History is often described as what remains, but perhaps it is also shaped by what was deliberately chosen to remain, hidden until the future was ready or desperate enough to look again. And if knowledge can be buried with such care, then forgetting may not be an accident at all. It may be one more architecture built by human hands. What if one of the war's strangest ambitions was to listen, not to the enemy, but to the sky itself? On a windswept stretch of northern coast, where the sea met black stone and winter seemed to arrive before autumn had fully left, Allied troops found the remains of an installation that did not resemble a standard radar post. Its towers were too narrow, its wiring too dense, its receiving dishes angled at peculiar elevations. The place looked improvised and exacting at once, as though built by people following a theory few others understood. Inside the main structure were banks of recording equipment, vacuum tubes, signal analyzers, and reels of paper filled with repeating wave patterns. Some logs referred to atmospheric disturbances, magnetic anomalies, and non-terrestrial intervals, a phrase so unusual it tempted immediate disbelief, yet other notes were more sober. They described efforts to detect long-range transmissions beyond known military bands, using the upper atmosphere as a medium and the planet itself as a resonant surface. It may have been nothing more than an ambitious communications experiment, a wartime attempt to exploit layers of the atmosphere for stealth reception or transmission. That is the most cautious and likely reading. But witness statements collected later complicated the picture. Operators reportedly worked in darkness for hours, headphones pressed tight, recording bursts of sound they could not classify. Some described tones like distant choirs, others like machinery turning beneath water. A few became convinced they were intercepting patterns that did not behave like ordinary coded signals at all. Whether those conclusions reflected real anomalies or the exhaustion of men pushed too far into isolation, the emotional truth remains compelling. War sharpens practical needs, but it also opens strange corridors in the human imagination. When ordinary systems break down, people begin to search beyond the visible horizon for guidance, warning, advantage, meaning. That coastal station now stands mostly in ruin, its instruments scattered and its purpose unresolved. But its silence still suggests a larger question. Human beings have always listened into darkness, hoping the void might answer back. And sometimes the mystery is not what we heard, but what it says about us that we kept listening, even when we could no longer be sure who or what might be speaking. What if the most unsettling discoveries were the ones that tried to imitate life itself? In the spring of 1945, a medical facility outside Prague was abandoned so quickly that half-finished meals still sat on metal trays when Allied investigators arrived. At first glance, it looked like a hospital annex: sterile corridors, tiled examination rooms, cabinets of surgical instruments. But deeper inside, in a sealed lower wing, the atmosphere changed. There were tanks for preserving tissue, work tables covered with anatomical sketches, and notebooks filled with measurements comparing nerve conductivity, muscular reaction, and artificial stimulation. The place felt less concerned with healing than with reconstruction. Among the recovered files were references to a project aimed at sustaining damaged bodies through external systems: pumps, electrical triggers, synthetic circulation aids, and crude interfaces between organic tissue and mechanical support. The language was fragmented, but the intention seemed clear enough: preserve function even when the body could no longer sustain itself naturally. In a time of catastrophic injury, that goal might sound merciful. Yet the documents went further. They spoke not only of survival, but of enhancement: reduced fatigue, altered pain response, prolonged operational usefulness. There is a thin line between medicine and instrumental thinking, and war has a way of wearing it down. A wounded soldier can be seen as a suffering person or as a system temporarily offline. Once the second idea takes hold, compassion and utility begin to share the same room, often uneasily. Witnesses later described patients connected to experimental apparatus for days at a time, some conscious, some heavily sedated, some apparently surviving injuries that should have been fatal. None of this proved success. Many of these efforts were likely crude, dangerous, and doomed. But even in failure, the project exposes a profound human temptation to treat mortality as a technical problem waiting for enough ingenuity. That temptation has never really left us. We still dream of extending function, outrunning frailty, preserving the self against decay. But every attempt to rescue life through machinery carries a question beneath the promise. When does saving the body become something else entirely? An attempt not to heal a person, but to refashion one. What if the final secret was not a machine, but a landscape transformed into a laboratory? In the last year of the war, travelers moving through a remote valley in Central Europe described odd weather that seemed to obey no season. Dense fog gathered in clear conditions. Static crawled over skin and clothing. Birds altered their routes. Compasses drifted, then steadied, then drifted again. At first, these stories sounded like the usual folklore that gathers around military zones. But after the front moved on, investigators found evidence that something deliberate had taken place there. The valley contained towers, buried cables, concrete footings, and the remains of generators positioned with geometric precision across several square miles. This was not a single installation. It was a field system. Technical fragments recovered on site referred to pressure differentials, ionization, atmospheric conductivity, and induced turbulence. The language suggested an extraordinary goal: not simply to observe local weather, but to influence it, to bend fog, wind, or electrical conditions into military advantage. Whether the system ever worked in a reliable way is doubtful. Weather is vast and stable and resistant to command, But wartime thinking often begins with impossibility and proceeds as though enough urgency can make nature negotiable. A bank of fog over an airfield, a sudden change in visibility, a field of static that confuses instruments. Small shifts like these could matter enormously in war, even if they fell far short of controlling the sky. What matters most, perhaps, is the imagination behind the attempt. Here was a project that treated the atmosphere not as background, but as territory. Air itself became something to engineer, as if the invisible forces around human life could be drafted into strategy. That vision carries a strange sadness. The more power people gather, the more they seem tempted to widen the circle of what must submit. Land, machines, bodies, memory, even weather. Yet nature does not surrender in the way human systems do. It absorbs, distorts, resists, and reminds us that control is often only temporary. And maybe that is why this forgotten valley still matters. It asks a question larger than war. When we try to master every uncertainty around us, are we expanding human possibility or simply revealing how little mystery we are willing to tolerate? What if the deepest fear behind all these projects was not defeat, but disappearance? As the war entered its closing chapter, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. In different regions, under different commands, with different languages of science and secrecy, the same impulse keeps returning. Build something that reaches beyond ordinary limits. A machine that predicts. A chamber that alters memory. A signal that enters the body. A vault that preserves what must survive collapse. Each project appears separate when viewed alone. Together, they begin to look like variations of a single obsession. This is the point where history becomes more reflective than forensic. Because even if every claim were reduced to its most cautious interpretation, the emotional architecture would remain. These were not only weapons programs or experimental facilities. They were expressions of a civilization under extreme pressure, trying to hold back uncertainty with steel, chemistry, mathematics, and control. Beneath the technical language was a more ancient desire to overcome fragility itself, and yet fragility kept returning, not only in bodies, but in records, in vanished names, in burned notebooks and sealed corridors. So much of what was built seems to have been consumed by the very chaos it was meant to outmaneuver. There is something almost poetic in that. The war generated immense systems of calculation and force, but in the end, many of its strangest ambitions dissolved into fragments, rumors, and damaged rooms reclaimed by moss, dust, and weather. Perhaps that is why these forgotten projects still resonate. They remind us that human beings are never only fighting the enemy before them. We are also wrestling with time, with mortality, with the humiliating fact that understanding is always incomplete. In moments of fear, we often answer that incompleteness with invention. Sometimes with brilliance, sometimes with cruelty, often with both at once. So the mystery is not merely what these projects were meant to do, it is what they reveal about us. When the world begins to collapse, what kinds of knowledge do we pursue? What are we trying to save? Life, power, memory, certainty. And when those goals become indistinguishable, how do we know what part of our humanity is being left behind? What if the true legacy of these forgotten projects did not end in 1945, but quietly entered the world that came after? Wars do not simply conclude, they scatter. Their debris settles into laboratories, intelligence services, universities, and industries that inherit more than equipment. They inherit questions, methods, ambitions, and habits of secrecy. After the fall of the regime that sponsored these strange experiments, the physical sites were raided, cataloged, dismantled, or quietly absorbed. Some scientists disappeared into prison systems. Others reappeared in new programs under new flags. The names changed, the language softened. But in many cases, the underlying dreams remained recognizable. This is where the story becomes less about one nation's wartime imagination and more about a broader human pattern. Technologies born in fear rarely vanish completely. They are repurposed, refined, made respectable. Ideas once framed as extreme are translated into more acceptable terms: performance optimization, behavioral research, advanced communications, environmental modeling, life support innovation. The moral atmosphere shifts, yet the central temptation survives. If something can be measured, perhaps it can be shaped. If it can be shaped, perhaps it can be controlled. That continuity should not lead us into paranoia. Most knowledge is not cursed. Science is not the villain in this story. Again and again, the same tools that emerge from conflict later help heal, connect, predict, and protect. The tragedy is more subtle than that. It lies in how easily purpose can drift when urgency overrides reflection. A device built to understand the brain can also be used to coerce it. A system meant to preserve life can be redirected toward extending utility at the cost of dignity. A model designed to reduce uncertainty can seduce its users into believing uncertainty itself is a flaw. Perhaps that is the inheritance these lost projects leave us. Not secret mastery, but a warning wrapped in fascination. We are always tempted to believe that one more breakthrough will rescue us from the limits of being human. Yet those limits, memory, hesitation, vulnerability, mortality, are not merely defects. They are part of what makes conscience possible. And if the future inherits the ambitions of the past, then the question is no longer what they tried to build back then. The question is what we are building now, and whether we have become wise enough to ask why. In the end, the war leaves us not only with ruins, but with echoes. Across forests, valleys, laboratories, monasteries, coastlines, and buried chambers, the fragments remain. A warm structure beneath frozen earth, a room built to fracture memory, instruments tuned toward invisible forces, a vault prepared for the survival of selected knowledge. Weather treated as a strategic surface, bodies approached as systems to be modified. None of these stories comes to us whole. Each is broken by fire, secrecy, fear, and time. And yet that brokenness may be the most honest part of all. Human history is rarely a clear archive. More often it is a field of partial signals, where meaning has to be assembled from what survives. That is why these forgotten wartime projects continue to matter. Not because they offer neat revelation, and not because they prove some hidden master narrative waiting beneath history. They matter because they illuminate a recurring truth about our species. In moments of crisis, we do not only defend ourselves, we imagine beyond ourselves. We try to predict what cannot be known, command what cannot be fully controlled, and preserve what we fear time will erase. Sometimes that effort produces courage, ingenuity, and beauty. Sometimes it carries us into moral darkness. Often it does both at once. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside all these vanished programs. The danger was never only in the machines or the compounds or the sealed archives. It was in the belief that knowledge without humility could save us from being human. But to be human is to live with uncertainty, to remember imperfectly, to act without complete foresight, to face mortality without surrendering compassion. These are not failures in the design. They are the conditions that make wisdom necessary. So when we look back at the mysteries buried beneath the Second World War, we are not simply peering into a lost chapter of technical ambition. We are confronting an old and unfinished question. How should human beings use what they discover, especially when discovery grants power over memory, nature, and one another? The answer is never final. It has to be chosen again and again by every generation that inherits the tools of the last. And perhaps that is why the silence around these projects still speaks. It reminds us that the future is not built by what we can do alone, but by what we decide should remain beyond our reach.